Olá! Essa conversa é uma atividade ligada ao workshop Demand-Led Growth. Esse evento já se encontra na 5ª edição e tem, através dos anos, reunido acadêmicos do Brasil e do mundo para discussões econômicas, tendo como fundamento a abordagem econômica que coloca como eixo do crescimento e do desenvolvimento econômico o comportamento dos componentes da demanda efetiva. Essa interpretação tem uma longa tradição no Instituto de Economia da UFRJ. Essa 5ª edição é organizada pelo Instituto de Economia da UFRJ e o Centro Internacional Celso Furtado, e conta com o patrocínio do BNDES, CNPq, o ISI e o Corecon Rio de Janeiro. E tem a participação de convidados internacionais, 5 palestrantes internacionais, 5 palestrantes nacionais e a apresentação de artigos originais por acadêmicos de todo o mundo. Em resumo, a longevidade e a repercussão desse evento atestam a relevância e vigor do pensamento crítico, na sua capacidade de apontar caminhos alternativos de política econômica. Esses caminhos alternativos, eles são muito necessários no momento que o mundo vive atualmente, com uma série de crises. A emergência climática, o crescimento do movimento de extrema-direita, a perda da representatividade das políticas ou dos movimentos políticos tradicionais, bem como uma incapacidade das teorias convencionais responderem às demandas sociais mais urgentes. Para discutir algum desses temas muito atuais, nós chamamos 2 participantes do 5º workshop, e onde eles mesmos discutiram esse tema específico, os sistemas monetários internacionais. É o que iremos debater aqui, além de outros temas que são correlatos a essa questão dos sistemas monetários internacionais. So, first of all, I would like to thank you, Professor Ramaa Vausdevan, for accepting our invitation to be here today and to have these conversations on such important topics. Professor Vausdevan is a professor at Colorado State University, and Professor Franklin Serrano is professor in our university, UFRJ. He's also my friend for more than almost 40 years. So today we have another of the million conversations. I wish I will learn a lot, and probably the public also. Professor Vausdevan, historically, industrial capitalism since the 19th century has been characterized by international monetary systems, which, as you write in an article in 2008, have their roots in the imperialist hegemony of 2 countries so far, the Great Britain and the US. Even though this is a complex topic, is it possible for you to explore it or the connection between the political hegemony and international monetary order?
First, thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure. So, where the sanctions on Russia after its invasion of Ukraine basically brought to the fore the fact that the dollar can be weaponized. So sanctions on Russia, freezing of reserves are a political weapon in imperial kind of statecraft, but equally when you see the riots and the protests happening in Kenya today, as a response to the kind of IMF promoted austerity package, which raised taxes on the ordinary things which people are consuming, and people are out on the streets. That shows you another face of the power and violence and coercion that is inherent in this monetary system. And the experience of Kenya right now is not new. One has seen similar packages being imposed, after the debt crisis in the 80s in Latin America, through the 90s, through the 2000s. Every time there's a flow of capital, there's a debt crisis, and then there's a tightening of the noose, basically. And this involves, on one hand, a restriction of what developing countries can do. They have to cut their budgets, they have to tighten the belts, there's limited policy space. On the other hand, there is also a reshaping of their production structures, which allows extraction. So this is kind of financial subordination, and this is done kind of through the aegis of IMF, World Bank, and basically forcing, and it's violent. It's a form of violence. And you can see the history of this violence if you look at the 19th century England again. So, for example, in the 1880s, when Egypt, under the Khedive dynasty, was basically going to default on debt, gunboats were sent out. Similarly, in Central America, gunboats were sent out. Now you don't need gunboats. And in fact, in 1890, Argentina, when was suffering a crisis, and Barings Bank in England was going to go under. At that time, the rescue Rothschild, a financier, was kind of headed a committee to basically do exactly the same thing. How do you ensure that creditors get paid? How do you tighten the belt? So here, unlike the Khedive dynasty, the treasury wasn't seized, through military control, but through a privately engineered debt negotiation. Now we have the IMF to do it. And this is the violent face and the shape of power in debt dynamics. And there's another aspect. So one is in terms of core and periphery, what is done to debtor countries in the periphery. But it's also seen in the relationship between how in the ordering in the core. So the Napoleonic Wars basically set the stage because debt was used to finance that, and you had the financial markets in Britain basically surged. Rothschild made its first fortunes, and that was the beginning of the growth of finance in Britain. Again, the Franco-Prussian War is when the eclipse of Paris as a market happens, and at the same time, the fact that it's the reparations of France were linked to sterling and gold and not to the franc, basically established sterling as the heart of the sterling empire. And you see a similar thing in the kind of war financing and debt diplomacy in the dislodging of sterling and the kind of in the interwar and post-war period through the Lend-Lease and the interlied debt arrangements. So basically, and finally, I think that's the Suez Crisis again. The U.S. didn't directly intervene, but when Britain was kind of sending its trying to invade the Suez after the Suez was nationalized, basically the IMF was used to twist Britain's arm, and the first kind of capital account kind of bailout by the IMF. So again, debt, war, guns, it's all linked. It's power. So. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so the debt is related to the monetary, the money that is dominating the world system, monetary system at each period of time.
Absolutely. And the fact that it's controlled, so there's one part of the monetary system which has to do with the fact that this is the financial center. The City of London was the financial center. New York is the financial center now. And that underpins sterling hegemony and dollar hegemony. But apart from the fact that the normal growth of finance and power, debt is a coercive instrument used to, further the empire of finance, basically.
Okay.
Without military, even without sending the gunboats.
This is before the gunboats, you have that.
Yeah.
So
now the new
if you don't pay the
gunboats.
debt, okay, you have the gunboats.
But sometimes you still have that, like when Elliott Fund seized the Argentinian ship off the coast of Ghana.
Yeah, that's true.
So sometimes the mask slips.
Okay, thank you very much. Professor Serrano, you're presenting this workshop a paper about the turbulent decade of the 70s. In particular, you discuss whether the actions of U.S. policymakers were a deliberate attempt to maintain the hegemonic position of the U.S. economy in international order, or a sign of weakness. Sometimes it's interpreted as a sign of weakness, and you have a different vision for this reading. So to what extent might the experience shed light on the general mechanism of transition from one international monetary system to another? That's something that's being discussed now.
Actually, my co-author Deborah Gaspar is presenting, and I'm there, but and because it's a joint paper based on her PhD dissertation. Mm-hmm. Now, the prevailing view in a good part of the best literature is that in the 70s there was a non-system, in the sense that the traditional Bretton Woods gold dollar standard had collapsed after 71, and there was sort of nothing to replace it until sometime either in 79 or in the early 80s. Now, in fact, this paper tries to show using documents from U.S. government officials in the Nixon administration, that the traditional story that financial deregulation or excessive balance of payments deficits of the U.S. or with very little gold backing caused the problem. But in fact, from the beginning, the U.S. officials were actually since '69 they were already discussing what to do in '71, and very conscious that the main fear was not the world abandoning the dollar. What would happen to their allies? The kind of instability that would cause. It's very interesting. They had no worries about this, and they were really worried if they needed to keep some sort of fixed exchange rate helping the allies, or maybe not. This was too much trouble. In the end, by '73, this was in '71 when Nixon ended the gold exchange standard, the dollar gold standard. By '73, they thought it was too much trouble, and they said, and then they started what I have called many papers the so-called floating dollar standards. And the motivation was that, and explicit, and Nixon says that on TV. You can find his speech in August '71 on the YouTube. He said the U.S. will never again be constrained by financial market speculations outside, and also we will not accept unfair competition, under quotes, from our allies that we helped to rebuild, and now they want to compete on an even term. So clearly it was an act of force, according to them, not to me, and actually excluded the last constraint, the last possibility of any kind of balance of payments constraints for the U.S. economy. And it is funny that in the negotiations before, all the allies said, well, we need a more symmetric system. But a more symmetric system, now it's your time, the U.S., to start adjusting. And they said, no, destroy the system. On the other hand, this confidence that everything would turn out all right for the U.S. actually was based on the fact that the world economy for the whole post-war period was already a dollar economy. The gold had a very limited role in settling balance of payments among the countries, and it was so. It was replying to your question. It was an act of force, more explicit, and it's more conscious than you can find in my old papers on that. So the contribution, especially, that's why I mentioned that, because it was her research on the actual files records that made this helped me make this revision. And in relative to your second question, I mean, it's difficult to make a theory with only two cases. But what you can say, I think, what Ramaa has pointed out, is that contrary to the prevailing view, including most heterodox economics, it's not the market that chooses the real international man, the actual dominant international man. Is not a coincidence that she mentioned the Napoleonic Wars. The actual British sterling standard really starts after the Napoleonic Wars, and the others started joining, but because it is the military dominance of the biggest, the most powerful country that makes that is an issue. As inside the country, the money that we use is issued by the state. In the international environment, there is only this sort of world money when one state has this overwhelming power relative to other powerful nations. And this really happened with England, and again, it's not a real coincidence that after the First World War, and of course with the enormous development or productive development of the U.S. and the fact that Britain got in that with the U.S. after the war and during the First War, that slowly and steadily after the Second War, of course, we were, Britain was even more in that. And then the political reality of a new dollar economy existed. And this was so dominant that, as I said, in the 70s, the U.S. wanted to put this a notch further in this new system that never existed before, that not only it's the dominant currency, they don't even have to bother with fixed exchange rates or any kind of, or having some gold or something. Now they don't need anything. So now I think, as using the expression she used, in this regard, the mask has fallen in 71. Like, it's just raw power. It has nothing to do with the market choosing, nor with I have some gold. No, in the end, it's power.
We are the most powerful country in the world, and so that's our time. That's our money.
It. Yeah. I think this is important because there's a lot of confusion on this regard.
But it's also a little, if I may,
of course.
What it shows you is you have economic power, finance, and you have the political authority of the state, and they're fused because finance becomes a means, because now you don't need the gunboats. You can do it through the power of finance. So in some senses, it's market and states kind of, instance, in this interplay to establish hegemony. It's a very important
point because the financial institution normally can be defined in a simplified way as some entity that borrows short and lends long. Yeah. Now, by definition, this kind of institution has a potential liquidity or funding problem, which is sometimes there's a mismatch between one thing and the other. No? You need, your depositors want the money now, or you're only getting the money along. So, because of that, the private financial sector in any economy desperately needs a lender of last resort, which is who can be the lender of resort? The central bank. So you would never have financial dominance, not even inside the country, especially outside the country, without the central bank and therefore the state of the dominant state. Otherwise, it's not, for instance, the so-called financial globalization or financial whatever, was in dollars. The whole world liberated short-term capital flows. The U.S. only liberated its capital flows in the 1st of January of 1974, after the possibility of them having any kind of balance of payments constraint disappeared. And then they said, now we liberalize. Now it's your turn. But there's a little asymmetry there. So the financial dominance comes with the monetary, behind it the monetary dominance, and behind it the state military power, technological and military.
But this lender of last resort is also, there's also what's called the doom loop dimension. So on one hand, you have a lot of elasticity in the system because it's state, but it's a lot of there are a lot of private dollars floating around. There's a lot of private liquidity, financial elasticity, but that creates fragility and crisis. And then you need the state. But the fact that the state is, the Fed is willing to do extraordinary actions to prop up the financial system also means that the financial system takes bigger bets. So the bets keep getting bigger, and in some sense, the Fed is an international lender of last resort, but it's also hostage, because if it doesn't do it, the whole financial system will collapse. So
we saw in 2008.
You saw it in 2020 during the pandemic. You saw it
between the state and the
market. Is this the doom loop is one of the.
That's interesting. But Professor Vausdevan, you argue there's a connection you mentioned here between in the spread of neoliberalism and the perception of serious political and economic problems in Western countries. For example, I mentioned here the growth of the far right in several countries. And recently you have seen some change in U.S. policy toward the labor unions and industrial policy. There's a different government. Biden government is different than the prior governments, even the Democrat ones. However, in a recent article, Professor James Galbraith, he described there's a manifesto by several economists, more progressive, even there are conventional but progressive ones, that in favor of industrial politics, for example, that this would be a pipe dream because such a thing requires state capacity, and it's been hollowed out over the 40 years of neoliberal neglect and predation. So, do you believe, so that's the idea that it's, the state is weak somehow, and the neoliberal order does not attack the workers, but the whole capacity of state to organize the economy. So that's the point Professor Galbraith says. And so, in your idea, you think it's possible that the neoliberal order can kind of reinvent itself and change the course of Western policies in several countries without a political break or something, a political rupture with the current policy.
The new Washington
political,
consensus.
New Washington, a different Washington consensus, much more progressive and that's such.
So the global economy is a financialized economy, and the neoliberal order is a capitalist order, but it is a order where finance is dominant and finance is on command. And you can see that in the fact that, in the study of global corporations, if you take the core of corporations which control more than 40% of global GDP, 3/4 of that is financial institutions. So financial institutions are really at the helm. 2% of the shareholders, they own 80% of financial assets. Other studies have shown. And now to add to global banks, now we have asset management funds who have also added another, so now they are part of the high table of finance, the inner circle. So the big three, BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, they own about more than 40%. They are large owners of more than 40% of corporations, and they have ownership in about 80%. So you have this phenomena of this indirect finance being in command and controlling. And you can, part of it is through squeeze of wages. Common ownership has led to squeeze of wages. There's also political pressure. There's also things like suddenly BlackRock says, no, we're not interested in green investment anymore, and it pulls out of the alliance. So the problem with finance is that its goals are short-term, speculative returns. And what we're talking about in terms of industrial policy or green transitions is something which is long-term. And there's a fundamental contradiction between the short-term goals of finance and the long-term goals of development or international. And they are not compatible. So as long as finance is in command, it has no interest. And this hope that, the developing countries are told to escort finance, private finance in public-private partnerships. That's really, really, it's a project which is doomed, and we've already seen there's a trickle of finance coming into green investment. So I think that project is problematic. And again, it goes back to the fact that, finance's interests are completely different. So we can't, and this financial system is also, there's, on one hand, it's linked to the role of the dollar. The global dollar has got its resilience by feeding off private finance, and basically knowing that the Fed will bail it out. That has created a really untenable situation for unless one actually breaks up finance, reduces its power, and allows, not the mandates of global investors, but the social priorities of democratically accountable states to actually be in play. Because the global dollar regime is, of course, as I said before, something which subordinates the periphery. So the cost, there's an exorbitant privilege to the dollar, but the duty, the cost falls on working people all over the world, but also on working people in the US. We saw that in the subprime crisis. Or, so it's ultimately also the coordination of capital with finance and command against workers of the world in some senses. And that militates against those goals. When neoliberalism can't be reformed, the order has to be dismantled to create something new and different. And that has to kind of come from, some different kind of alliances where finance serves social goals it doesn't override them. So that's a different social contract which needs to be established. So,
I think that something happened now in the U.S. is kind of a different government than the prior. We have in France now that's all the turmoil to maybe we will to define a middle ground program.
Yeah.
I think there are many things in your question. The first concerning the manifesto you mentioned, only sorry to be so critical, but it seems confirm the well intended but unbelievable naivety of our friends, progressive American economists, to say that the U.S. there is no industrial policy.
Okay, I agree.
When you have the military-industrial complex that is the very thinly disguised, but the biggest, more interventionist, more active, more detailed set of industrial policies ever implemented in any country. By the way, the only country that's trying to do something similar now is China. And so I think they know it works.
Try to defend them. Maybe they're talking about transition.
Yeah, now you can say that it would, then it has more to do with what Ramaa said. The difficulty would be, especially the thing that she said about the long run, because these are state policies, and the political will to sustainably do with the strange politics in the West and all the different coalitions, of course, and the short-termism of finance, etc. To do this in a longer perspective on these more interesting things, not military, not national security, of course, it's more complicated. But on the other hand, there is a tendency also in this, already in the Trump government before, in also in Biden, because it's not doesn't depend only on the political, sort of in the state goals, that the U.S. Sort of after a period in which it didn't pay much attention, the U.S. state, not particularly Trump or Biden, woke up for that now there is a country doing exactly everything that they did, like the U.S. did everything it did, and Britain didn't pay much attention to it. So there has been a sort of attention deficit, but they woke up for that. So there is, if they manage to put this agenda as a question of national security, as they are trying to weaponize the competition with China, etc., then perhaps they would do it. Of course, it's not the way we would like, but something. Now, the other problem is that the political aspects of the class relations. I think the results, both of Biden's actual policies, not only in the economy as a whole and also related to unions, with all the limitations of the Democratic Party, etc., I think it shows some progress relative to the Democrats before, which is that there is a limit. The people can't stand anymore. How the minimum wages in the West, okay, for instance, they didn't manage to pass the federal minimum wage, but more than 20 states increased the minimum wage. So there is, I think there, and I think in Europe and other places, of course, there's the movement toward the right, but there is this sort of...
so they reach the minimum subsistent level.
Yeah, so you get some reactions, some really bad, with people in the extreme right pretending they are for the workers, but you get the official left.
Just won the election.
Just won the election. With all the limitations, the new labor now is the new labor is even more neoliberal than But, okay, it's not the crazy people from Farage, it's not conservative. And in France also with all the limitations. So I don't think there is this huge...
you don't need this huge break from the past. It's something
no, it's just like, do it a little less. You're reaching limits. Do a little thing. You didn't, of course. People use as a reference the golden age with social democrats, social contract. I said, okay, what be that? But before that, in the end of the 19th century, beginning, the welfare state started. There were minimum wage here and there. So you don't need only the supposedly wonderful golden age, or the horrible neoliberalism. In my opinion, I may be considered very optimistic. As you know me for many years, you know I'm always a very optimistic guy. I think the real worst thing was the 90s, the nightmare. Because it was the uncontested dominance of capital and all the now it's much worse. There is a struggle, but history ended for about 10 years. And then we started with our pink wave here and down all this conflict. So it's not guaranteed that some progress cannot be made here and there. And you see that in the reaction of the press. Everybody's so sort of helpless in the more progressive circles. They just say, oh, okay, the right is going to win. And when it doesn't happen, they are totally surprised because they make catastrophic things like Bolsonaro was going to win here. No, he lost. They will win in Europe. No, in some countries they're okay, but in France they lost. So it's not, in US, for instance, people have written off Biden completely. I'm not sure. Because the economy is going well, the wages are increasing. There are things at the base of power of the Democratic Party that if they put these people to go to vote, maybe you win. I'm not saying that. Saying it's not. I don't know. Just because of you get a noisy. To use an expression from Richard Nixon that I liked very much, the silent majority. Now, both here and in many countries, the silent majority that in Nixon's time was to the left or to the right of the noisy minority. Now the silent majority may be not the same, but it's clearly to the left of the noisy minority. The right minority. So I think I think the majority, it's open. It's not this nightmare. There is nowhere to run. It's only going to get worse. It's difficult. It's complicated. But this
you are an optimist.
I am an optimist because I think there is an interesting. I think the most important thing nowadays in the world economy. There's an interesting contradiction between this outstanding success in terms of class conflict of decades of austerity, neoliberalism, etc. in the rich countries, but that require very slow growth. Okay, congratulations. But China, India, and many other developing countries are not worried about that yet. And are growing incredibly. So there is a great class victory that's beginning to clash with geopolitical things. That's the basis for my optimism or whatever. It's not easy. They are having to do things that if they had this international agreement of all capitalists to impose policy, but you don't find this even with all the horrible things in the government. India talk about the economic development, and China and many Asian countries. Also because we are from Latin America, we don't grow here. They're very pessimistic. Things are not that bad. After 2000, we grew a little and stopped. The rest of the development did not stop. Of course, now there are problems in that very poor that crisis in very poor countries. Yes, of course, there are problems in Nigeria, but overall, it's not as bad as the mid-90s onward.
Okay. I agree. So, my next question is connected to what you said. You said that China is emerging as a major player in the global economy, and there's a combination of factors or problems, at least we understand, in Western countries. So that has triggered the discussion about the end of the dollar standard. So, in your opinion, to what extent do you think that this transition is actually taking place, or it's more a question of a coexistence of two important international economic poles? If it's possible, this coexistence of international economic poles.
I think that apart from a very limited historical period of British dominance and then absolute British dominance, then later after the Second World War, American dominance, we always had many powers in the world, military and economic powers, with their currencies were more strong than the others. And I think we don't, just because we had two that were completely dominant, you not necessarily need to have a third. And on the other hand, what has happened, there's no problem having many countries that are powerful with their currencies and their areas. And in particular, the increase in the international use of the Chinese currency, measuring any way you want, has been remarkable. And it's part of it's a sort of natural outcome of a country that becomes the biggest trader with so many countries, of course. And if you need to buy a lot of things in China, why not to use the currency? So there is a part that's sort of inevitable. There is some policy part that's policy induced, but this part is more policy induced to increase the internationalization. It's very much a reaction against the weaponization of the dollar. It's not that they really wanted to be the next dollar. It's that they are being worried, with good reason, of relying only in the dollar. And finally, there's another thing that most people don't see. It's very funny. The people that think that dollar standard will continue a long time, they show statistics that are correct, that really the dollar dominance in quantitative terms has barely changed. And the people who say that China is going to prevail and the dollar standard, they show that Chinese monetary, financial, international expansion is very big. But there is no contradiction there, because all the increase in the share of the Chinese yuan, in whatever indicator you look at, came at the expense of the other advanced countries. Japan, all the euro, the people said. So at the moment, what we are going towards, I think that's more and more clear, is that not a really multipolar world, as people were saying, but as bipolar world.
Bipolar
it's a funny,
world.
strange name. But a bipolar world in the sense that there is sort of the U.S., for instance, getting stronger relative to its allies. You see the reconstitution of NATO, all the Atlantic. And China, partially because of our own faults, is getting more strong relative to these more independent developing countries. So you're getting these two hierarchies. Of course, the countries that are smarter, they are in the middle. They have smarter foreign policies that, like Turkey or India, that really confuses people. You don't know if they're allied or not. They play the non-aligned card very well. The ones that don't play this well or have no condition attached to one.
We are the no smart countries, unfortunately.
Not very important. If you want to hear my optimistic thing, don't talk about Brazil. So I'm saying that there is this strange sort of G2 organization. There's the two, and then the rest, the second league, which is different from what was before. It's not this absolute dollar, but it doesn't need a collapse. You don't need to predict a collapse of one or the other, or this great war. It can.
Yes,
but what actually happened up to now is this that I'm talking. I don't know what will happen in the future. So.
At this point, the U.S. is very aggressive reaction to China, but you think that somehow in the near future they will kind of accommodate the two poles or bipolar international order? Yeah, something like that.
I'm not sure that the one thing is I mean, I think Ramaa knows history much more than I do. The capitalist powers always threatened and traded. Always menaced and financed. Why you need to be nice? I mean, or being war. I don't. I think people exaggerate too much. So I don't think the U.S. will be less aggressive in its rhetoric. But trade with China did not end. They are not bombing Taiwan.
They keep trading.
Yeah.
So, because they are connected.
Yes,
they both economies.
They make a lot of money. I mean,
yes.
Germany traded with a lot of countries, including the Soviet Union, before the Second War, and then decided to invade the Soviet Union. Okay, but it's not written in the stars that if you must be bad, and then even no, it's just normal power politics. Sometimes gets out of control. Yes, it's a dangerous game. There could be wars, etc., but it doesn't have to be so. So I think people are so desperately trying to find a solution where it's going to be. No, the world is complicated. I mean, it gets more simple when only one dominant country is. Yes, not much fun if you're not from the one country.
And if you're not in the core.
And it gets more complicated when you have more space.
It was a disgrace for us what happened in the
Imagine the
end.
interwar period. It was a big mess. But okay, and so you can find in other periods in which you didn't have one dominant thing. So I think there's what they call the theory of hegemonic stability.
Yeah.
It's a mechanical, and as I said, a theory based on two observation, and it is why I think why can't you have 2, 3, 4 powers? It doesn't. There's no reason why the future has to repeat the past. It's not based on anything. This exaggerated, deterministic trends. We'll have to see.
Ramaa, your comments on this part.
So, China, I don't think, is interested in displacing the dollar.
Yes.
What China wants to do
This
is
the point.
it's been kind of champing at the bit because here it is this large economy, growing economy with surpluses, and yet it cannot lend in renminbi. It cannot. It is kind of, it was under the umbrella of the dollar. And so what I think the internationalization of the renminbi is about is basically creating space, because it really rankled. And their policy is kind of sometimes what's called crossing the river by feeling the pebbles. So it is this very kind of arm's length kind of liberalization and two-step, and then pull back, clamp down on finance, clamp down on, the big tech. So it's this peculiar thing where the state is very much in charge and wants to keep finance, wants to internationalize renminbi while keeping finance, under control, which is it's like a tightrope act. And China has been doing this, and very pragmatically. But I don't think the project is not to displace the dollar. And even in terms of the biggest move has been in terms of trade invoicing, but that is also only with trading partners. So 50% of China's trade with its partners is invoiced in the yuan. But it's not other countries who are trading amongst themselves. And that has changed only now after the sanctions. So now there's a little more space for that. The two things where China is kind of ahead and where the status is, one is pushing on AI, and two is pushing on digital currency. And and building the infrastructure for that. Right now, the infrastructure is more domestic, but it's exploring that. So those are the things to watch for, I think, vis-a-vis China.
Okay. So I think we have a very interesting conversation. We kind of time's out here, but thank you very much for coming, for having this talk. In Centro Celso Furtado, we'll try to continue to have these programs, try to clarify those complex points. Of course, in just one discussion is not easy, but there are points that will be more discussions in our institution. Thank you very much. Eu queria dizer que esse programa aqui tem o patrocínio do BNDES, que apoiou o 5º Encontro International Workshop of Demand-Led Growth, e também essa conversa com os amigos Franklin Serrano e Ramaa Vausdevan. Sorry. Thank you very much.
Thank you.